It is impossible to understand the world. It is impossible to understand man. It is impossible to understand the disintegration of matter. It is impossible to understand the collapsing world and universe. It is impossible to understand man's behavior if you do not understand that it is all a product of sin.
Welcome to a new week of Grace to You, featuring the verse-by-verse Bible teaching of John Macarthur, president of the Masters University and Seminary. Today, John is considering a subject that, you can't afford to ignore, though some people, even some pastors, pay no attention to it. The subject is sin. Specifically, where did sin begin? And that's the title of John's series that he launches today. John, the title, Where Did Sin Begin? What's the benefit of looking at the origin of sin? What do you hope folks will take away from this study?
Well, first of all, there's a benefit in looking at the origin of sin because everybody wants to know that. Where did all the evil come from? I can remember so many times being on CNN television with Larry King, and the topic would come around to, why is there sin? If God is all-powerful and God is all-loving, why is there sin? Where did it come from? How did it arrive in the world? I think it's really important for us as believers to have an answer for that, and there is biblical truth that speaks to that issue. That is one of the big questions that Christians must face. If God is powerful and all-powerful, if He is loving and all-loving, why is there sin in the world? What is the answer? Where do we go for that? Well, of course, those of you who are believers know we go to the book of Genesis, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at where sin began, and the record of that is in the book of Genesis. A number of years ago, I did a study in the book of Genesis. I got all the way through chapter 11 in that initial study because I wanted to cover the beginnings. And Genesis is a book about beginnings, not only the beginning of sin, but the beginning of creation, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of the earth, the beginning of everything that occupies the earth, the beginning of human history, and, of course, the beginning of sin. We're going to be exploring fascinating questions like, what is sin? What is sin like? How many people does sin affect? How does it affect them? Where exactly did it come from? What role does God play in the arrival of sin? And we're going to talk about the elements in the extent of man's sinfulness. For 5 days, you don't want to miss one broadcast. Where did sin begin? And since it affects all of us, this is vitally important.
Every nation, every church, every person faces turmoil of one kind or another. And while there are a lot of ideas about where those problems come from and how to solve them, only God's Word probes the root cause, sin. To make sure that you understand what your greatest problem truly is and how to address it, stay with us now as John Macarthur launches his study, Where Did Sin Begin?
Genesis chapter 3 is familiar to us. It is a chapter that deals with a serpent in the garden and temptation and forbidden fruit, and a woman who was deceived, and a man who followed her in violating God's word and God's command. It then talks about a curse and the price that was paid for that disobedience. This chapter may well be the most important chapter in the Bible. Certainly it is true that if you don't understand this chapter, you don't understand the rest of the Bible. You cannot understand the solution to the problem unless you understand the problem. You cannot understand the cure unless you understand the diagnosis. You will never be able to understand God's remedy for this world if you don't understand the malady under which this world lives and functions. I say it may well be the most important chapter in the Bible because it explains absolutely everything about our universe and about life in that universe and all of us who live in it. It explains everything about why things are the way they are, why we are the way we are, and what God is doing in history and why He's doing it in terms of salvation. Genesis 3 explains the human dilemma. All the problems in the universe have their origin in the events of this historic account. I'll say that again. All the problems in the universe. Physical problems, spiritual problems, moral problems, social problems, economic problems, political problems, all the problems in the universe have their origin in the events of this historic account. This chapter, then, is the foundation of any true and accurate worldview. And without this foundation, every and any worldview is utterly wrong. If you do not understand the origin of sin and its impact based on Genesis chapter 3, then your understanding of the world is wrong. Everything, then, is misunderstood. Everything is misevaluated. Everything is misread. Everything is misdiagnosed and hopelessly incurable. You see, if you go back to the end of chapter 1, it says, "And God saw all that he had made, and he had made all that has ever been made." So he saw the whole created universe. "And behold, it was very good." When God completed the original creation, everything was very good. But frankly, folks, everything in our world now is very bad. It is anything but good. And it has been anything but good through all of human history. When God completed his perfect creation, it was very good because there was no disorder, there was no chaos, there was no conflict, there was no struggle, there was no pain, there was no discord, there was no disease, there was no decline, there was no death. Now, we all live our whole lives with all of that. Life is defined by disorder, chaos, conflict, struggle, pain, discord, disease, decline, and death. So we have to ask a question. If we come to the end of Genesis 1 and everything is very good and we take a look at things, we have to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? What is wrong here? This is not the way it was at the beginning. Even going through chapter 2, you really have only an expansion of the created work of God on day 6. Chapter 2 just expands on the creation of man and woman that's mentioned from verse 24 down through the end of chapter 1. So you could put verse 31 at the end of chapter 2. It was really at the same point in terms of God's creation. God saw everything that he had made, including man, including woman, including the garden where he placed them, all that's described in chapter 2, and it was all very good. But we look at the world today and it's not very good. Evolutionists really amuse me. They are clueless about this because they're living under the self-deception that man is getting better, that he's improving. The idea of evolution is that man starts from simplicity and mutates upward into complexity. That he starts from a very low and minimalistic level of intelligence and mutates upward to a greater intelligence. That he starts at a base level morally and he moves up to a higher and higher level morally. But the fact of just life itself, the truth about man, is a refutation of evolution. Because the fact of the matter is, man isn't getting better. He's getting worse. He's accumulating iniquities at a rapid rate. And with technological advances, he is accumulating wretchedness faster than ever. Man did not begin at the bottom of the moral ladder and slowly by psychological evolution rise higher. That's just not true. In fact, if you study human history, basically there hasn't really been any change Men are morally no better than they were in the past, and I suppose in some ways no worse than they were in the past. You can trace the patterns of wretchedness through all of human history. But the advancements that have come technologically and by science through the centuries have only enabled man to escalate and exacerbate his corruption. What has gone wrong? If man began at the top, as Genesis 1 and 2 would tell us, and everything was very good, and man was created in the image of God, he started at the top, and he's been plunging down through the abyss of darkness, headed toward a deep bottom ever since. What went wrong? What happened here? This isn't the way it was in the original creation. The downward plunge doesn't seem to be able to be stopped. It's like man has fallen from heaven without a parachute, and he's plunging at breakneck speed toward hell with nothing to stop him. And his life is basically defined by wickedness and evil in every aspect, every relationship. What happened is recorded for us in Genesis 3. Let me read you the first 7 verses. Now the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, "Indeed, has God said, 'You shall not eat from any tree of the garden?' And the woman said to the serpent, 'From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat. But from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat from it or touch it, lest you die.' And the serpent said to the woman, 'You surely shall not die.'" What's death? No such thing existed. "For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. At the end of chapter 2, you notice that the man and his wife were naked and not ashamed. There wasn't anything to be ashamed about because there was no sin. There were no evil thoughts, nothing to be ashamed about. But you come to the end of the record I just read to you. In verse 7, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. All of a sudden, there was shame. Why? For the first time in their existence, they had wicked thoughts. Never had a wicked thought before. And apparently it had something to do with their sexuality. All of a sudden there was shame where there was no shame. This is the great indicator from their viewpoint that they had sinned. And the indicator from God's viewpoint comes when he says in verse 16, "To the woman I'll multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband. He shall rule over you." Then to Adam he said, "Because you have listened to the voice of your wife, you've eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, You shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles will grow for you. You shall eat the plants of the field by the sweat of your face. You shall eat bread till you return to the ground, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return." Now, when God curses them, it's quite interesting. Those curses really are physical. There is a curse on the woman's pain in childbearing and on her conflict in her marriage. There is a curse on Adam in the fact that he no longer is going to be able to just pluck the wonders of Eden. He's going to have to cultivate the ground. He's going to have to fight the thorns and thistles. He's going to have to sweat to bring forth his bread, and he's going to ultimately die. But those things really don't say anything about the moral change that took place. Well, you don't really need to say too much. becomes very apparent real quick. First of all, Adam and Eve felt shame, and shame is a function of guilt, and guilt is a function of sin, and somehow they had thoughts of wickedness and were so embarrassed by those that they sewed together some leaves to cover themselves. They brought forth 2 sons in chapter 4. One of them murdered the other one. And the rest, of course, is history. We don't know how long they enjoyed Eden in its glory. But once they fell, they were changed, they were altered, and they passed on fallenness and sin to every human being that ever lived, because they've all come from Adam and Eve. You see, in our time, if you don't understand that, you cannot explain the human dilemma. The evolutionist, the psychological evolutionist, sociological evolutionist has a big problem, because if man is getting more and more capable, if he's getting more and more noble, if he's mutating upward, and he has now reached a place where he's basically good and actually getting better, why is it that society's not changing? Why is he morally worse? Well, evolutionary psychologists say there must be something wrong with his environment. And it all boils down to, I'm not bad, but you're bad and you make me bad. So in this evolutionary process, some of us are going up and others, I guess, are going down. Fairly selective approach. Psychologists reject sin because they want to exalt man and they want to eliminate God. So because they reject sin, they have no explanation for why man is the way he is. They misdiagnose him totally, so they offer really no help. And what do? We try to come up with harsher penalties. The 3-strike law, 3 felonies in a row, and you go to jail and they throw the key away. We bring back the death penalty, but nothing can end the reign of terror. Nothing can end the reign of corruption. You can't do it with counseling. You can't do it with psychotherapy. You can't do it with Prozac. You can't do it. Because the issue is sin. The issue is we have all inherited a corrupted nature. Dr. Carl Menninger, the Menninger Clinic, wrote this: in all of the laments and reproaches made by our seers and prophets, one misses any mention of sin, a word which used to be a veritable watchword of prophets. It was a word once in everybody's mind, now rarely if ever heard. Does that mean that no sin is involved in all our troubles? Is no one any longer guilty of anything? Guilty perhaps of a sin that could be repented and repaired and atoned for? Is it only that someone may be stupid or sick or criminal or recovering or asleep? Wrong things are being done, he writes, we know. Tares are being sown in the wheat field at night. But is no one responsible? Is no one answerable for these acts? Anxiety and depression we all acknowledge, and even vague guilt feelings. But has no one committed any sins? Where indeed did sin go? What became of it? End quote. By the way, that's in the book he wrote called Whatever Became of Sin. And of course, there's just no interest in the public forum in talking about sin today. I mean, that is absolutely archaic. To say people are all born with an evil bent, that they are all born with a desire to violate the law of God and to dethrone God and replace Him with themselves, to say they are incapable of doing anything good, to say that they are rotten to the very core, that everything about them, everything they think, everything they say, and everything they do is only evil continually, to say their heart is deceitful and desperately wicked. Frankly, folks, that is just not acceptable in the public forum. Our culture has really declared war not only on sin, because they don't want anything defined as sin. Everything is just a lifestyle choice. Nothing is a sin. So our culture has declared war on sin and consequently declared war on guilt. The very idea of guilt is considered medieval, obsolete, and certainly unhelpful. There was a mega bestseller by Wayne Dyer, Dr. Wayne Dyer. It was called Your Erroneous Zones. And he said the most useless of all erroneous zones is guilt. He said, guilt, quote, must be exterminated, spray cleaned, and sterilized forever. We have to get rid of guilt. And he says, here's how you do it. Quote, do something which you know is bound to result in feelings of guilt. Take a week to be alone. If you've always wanted to do so, despite the guilt-engendering protestations from other members of your family, these kinds of behavior will help you tackle that omnipresent guilt. In other words, if you feel guilty about certain things, do them and just keep doing them till you don't feel guilty anymore. He says, defy your guilt. Spurn your husband. Spurn your children. Attack that sense of self-disapproval head on. Do something that is sure to make you feel guilty and just keep doing it till you don't feel guilty anymore. Refuse to hear the cries of conscience, the duties of family responsibility, the appeals of your loved ones. You owe it to yourself. Sear your conscience. Nobody treats guilt seriously anymore. You know, when people feel guilty nowadays, it's because they ate too many French fries. Those are the guilty pleasures. There was a headline in an advice column that caught my eye. It summed up the universal counsel of our generation. The headline said, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. Stop blaming yourself. The article said, your compulsive behavior is not your fault. Refuse to accept the blame. And above all, do not blame yourself for what you can't control. Heaping guilt on yourself only adds to your stress, low self-esteem, worry, depression, feelings of inadequacy, and dependence on others. Let go of your guilt feelings. And that ubiquitous Ann Landers has said, one of the most painful, self-mutilating, time and energy-consuming exercises in the human experience is guilt. It can ruin your day or your week or your life. It turns up like a bad penny when you do something dishonest, hurtful, tacky, selfish, or rotten. Never mind that it was the result of ignorance, stupidity, laziness, thoughtlessness, weak flesh, or clay feet. You did wrong, and the guilt is killing you. Too bad. But be assured, the guilt you feel is normal. Remember, guilt is a pollutant, and we don't need any more of it in the world. You don't want to feel bad about anything. Boy, what a serious issue this is, because you cut off people from the possibility of repentance. I love that story of the guy in New York City who, you probably heard it, you read about it or heard it in the news. He robbed a store, and the store owner grabbed a gun and shot him and paralyzed him, so that in the lower part of his body he was paralyzed, and he was then confined to a wheelchair. When the case came to trial, the attorney for the robber who had been shot by the man took the case on the basis that this man who shot him did not understand that the man who committed the crime was a victim of society, that he was driven to crime by his economic disadvantages. The lawyer said he now is a shooting victim of the insensitivity of the man who shot him. And he said, because of that man's callous disregard of the thief's plight as a victim, the poor thief is going to be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He deserves some compensation. And the jury agreed. And the store owner paid a huge settlement. What always fascinates me when I think about the story is, within 2 months, the man was arrested committing another armed robbery in his wheelchair. A woman who abused and brutally killed her own infant was acquitted of all charges because she had PMS. And you all remember the San Francisco city supervisor that was murdered. And when the person went on trial, it was a famous Twinkie defense, the fact that he was not responsible for what he did. He was acting irrationally because he ate too many Hostess Twinkies. And the famous Twinkie defense was born. We have so much of that in our society. Similar tactics, passing blame away from us. And when children are disobedient, they say they're hyperactive, or they have attention deficit syndrome, or whatever other syndrome they can invent so they can sell people the drugs they want to sell them. And when somebody commits moral sin, they say they're addicted to sex, and then they're recovering sex addicts. So we have to remember, like AA, you'll never really recover, so your whole life you're recovering, so don't feel bad if they slip up here and there. It's just an addiction. Everything wrong with mankind is described as some kind of an illness. And you know that. That's just the way the world chooses to avoid the issue. So we alone, I think, as Christians who understand the Bible and believe the Bible, we get it. We got all these people trying, all the politicians and all the moralists and all the educators and all the university people and all the sociologists and everybody trying to fix society, and it can't ever be done by these people because they don't ever deal with the reality of what is in the heart. All humanity, nobody escapes, has a vile, rebellious, corrupt nature. The thought life is corrupt, the emotions are corrupt, the will is corrupt, and the behavior is corrupt. And Genesis 3 is crucial to understanding that.
Sociologists can identify many of society's problems. Educators can help people understand aspects of them. Lawmakers can help limit some of those problems. But as John Macarthur reminded you today on Grace to You, there is no fix for society's sin problem. True change only comes when God transforms a person's heart. John has much more to say about this sin topic precisely in the current study called Where Did Sin Begin? Keep in mind that we won't have time to air the entire series this week, but you can have the entire study on CD or MP3s. Order today. The 3-CD album is available for $16. Shipping is free. You can order that now by calling toll-free 1-800-55-GRACE or by going to our website, gty.org. You also can download all 3 messages from the study Where Did Sin Begin?, along with more than 3,000 of John's sermons, free of charge in the MP3 or transcript format. That's available online at gty.org. Thank you for remembering that the support of listeners like you is what helps keep John's verse-by-verse teaching available free of charge to folks all around the world each day. That includes this broadcast, heard on more than 1,000 stations each day, as well as online resources and the many books and CDs that we give away through our mailing list. To support this ministry, mail your tax-deductible donation to Grace to You, Post Office Box 4000, Panorama City, California, 91412. Remember, you can also donate online at gty.org or when you call 1-800-55-GRACE. For John Macarthur and the entire staff, I'm Carl Miller. Thanks for tuning in today. Join us here tomorrow as John continues looking at the origin of sin and how to overcome its devastating effects in your life. It's another half hour of unleashing God's truth, one verse at a time, here on Grace to You.